It's the year 2100. Earth has changed. The atmosphere hangs blood red over a planet that barely resembles the world humanity once knew. A fighter jet cuts through that crimson sky, and standing on top of it, because apparently cockpits are for cowards, is Gene. He spots his target below, says, "Found him," and without a second thought, leaps off the jet. He tears through the air like a missile. Down on the surface, a little boy is sprinting for his life, screaming for anyone at all. He's sobbing completely alone until two monsters land right in front of him and behind him, boxing him in like they planned the whole thing. The boy is frozen between them, barely managing to choke out a plea for help. He clutches his family photo, screams into the void one more time, and then looks up, not at the monsters closing in, but at whatever cruel force turned the world into this, and thinks, make them pay. Then, a light flares directly above him. One blink later, both monsters are dead. Gene lands clean in front of the boy, and the kid stares up at him in total shock. Gene tells him, sorry for being late. The boy asks who he is, then immediately starts trembling, then crying, then full-on breaks down shouting, finally, we can take the world back, and throws himself at Gene in a hug, still sobbing purely. Gene says, yeah, then tells him to rest because the boy has a deep wound on his back. His last words are, thank you, and he falls. Gene stands over him in silence. A scientist materializes right on cue. This is Kagura. He asks Gene if he was too late. Gene says his name like an answer. Kagura tells him the boy was likely the last survivor of the entire era. He tells Gene to face the truth. Humanity is finished. Gene goes quiet, and his mind drifts back. The monsters ravaging Earth were born from centuries of environmental pollution, mutated, corrupted things humanity came to call corruptors. They had insane, regenerative ability. Nuclear weapons couldn't touch them. Humanity threw everything it had at them anyway, for as long as it could. And then, through relentless human experimentation, they finally found something that worked. Back in the present, Kagura, standing over the boy's body, says it didn't matter. They found it too late. There's no one left. Gene looks up and says there's still something worth saving. Kagura asks if he really thinks survivors are still out there. Gene says no, then turns around and points to the future instead. He asks about Kagura's nanomachines, the ones that destroy corruptor regeneration. Do they also help the planet recover? Kagura says, yeah. Gene lays it out. One day, the planet will reclaim its former beauty. And when it does, civilization will rise again. He smiles saying it. Kagura calls it quite the fairy tale. Gene just starts walking and says, that's fine. That tiny possibility, he says, that's enough. He makes his way to an underground laboratory bunker. His power might be needed in the future, so he steps into a tank filled with liquid and gets sealed inside. Kagura stands before the tank watching. Gene, betting everything on a perhaps, goes under. The cold sleep activates. Kagura takes one last look and leaves. The countdown begins. Outside, the corruptors roam freely. 5 years pass, and they're enormous, colossal things drifting across a planet stripped of every tree, every trace of green. 153 years, 376, the corruptors are still there. 5,000 years, 8,492. They rule without competition. At 32,416 years, they're still alive, though barely holding on. By 56,428 years, they're on the edge of extinction. Around 84,524 years, they start dying off in earnest. By 184,236 years, only a handful remain, some already fossilized mid-stride. The count keeps climbing. 750,192 years in, and tiny animals reappear. Civilizations begin to stir. Life crawls back. Then, 100 million years later, Jin's cold sleep ends. Access key confirmed. Starting cold sleep release sequence. At that exact moment, 3 people are running for their lives through the ruins. Beastkin, a girl, a heavy-set man, and a third companion. And something is hunting them from behind. The heavy-set one shouts, asking if Gene is really supposed to be in a place like this. The girl insists he is. The third one says if he isn't, they're dead. The girl shouts that he's here. She touches her locket. Ahead of them is a chamber. The guardian god, she says. He's in there. She throws it open. In front of them, Jin's cold sleep container. The girl goes still. The monster roars. The heavy-set man and the girl freeze in terror. The third one shouts, asking what they do. The girl trembles. She squeezes her eyes shut and begs, help us, God. Voice breaking. The monster lunges, and the chamber shatters. Understood. In the span of a single blink, Gene is out. He shields all 3 of them and puts the corruptor down. They stare at him, speechless. Gene turns to look at them and says, told you it was worth believing, didn't he? Standing there, not exactly dressed for the occasion, Gene has just killed the monster. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the future he bet on 100 million years ago has finally arrived. Gene glanced around the lab and popped open a briefcase. Kagura's storage box, exactly as expected. Clothes still in perfect condition after 100 million years. A Rubik's Cube and an injection filled with liquid, all sitting there like they'd been packed yesterday. He looked over the computers and noted that most of the data was corrupted, but the fact that anything survived at all was genuinely impressive. The nanomachines dispersed in the atmosphere must have kept the whole place intact. The injection, for the record, was nanomachines, too, preserved specifically for him. Gene picked up the Rubik's Cube and thought about what this world had become. The only thing he had to go on was the message Kagura left behind. But first things first, he turned to the three kids and said, "Let's hear your story." The heavy-set one immediately covered the girl's eyes. Gene said, "Oops, my bad," then pointed out, in his defense, that he'd been naked for 100 million years. The children stared at him in collective horror. He got dressed at record speed. Outfit on, Gene said it felt right. The lab door opened. Stepping outside, Gene was hit by blinding sunlight. Everyone squinted for a moment, and then it washed over him. Mountain, rivers, greenery stretching as far as he could see. Completely different from the scorched wasteland he remembered. He stood there and took it in. So, this is the world 100 million years later. The girl called out to him, "God, this way." And the heavy-set one and the third boy took off running. Gene followed, and as he did, his mind started working. Humanity should have gone extinct long ago. These three weren't human, not exactly. They'd evolved over 1 million years into something that resembled humanity, but wasn't quite it. The heavy-set boy had koala ears. The third had cat ears. Nanomachine influence, most likely. The fact that they still spoke the same language from 1 million years ago was good enough proof of the connection. Gene introduced himself as Shido Gene. Just Gene was fine. The girl said she was Hakama Phil. Just Hakama. The heavy-set one, Dampo. The third, Shandy. Gene fell into stride with them and asked what exactly they needed him to do. Hakama said they were almost there. They wanted him to defeat the corruptors. Gene started to ask something, but they arrived before he could finish. And what they arrived to stopped everything cold. Shandy froze. His whole village was burning. He screamed for his dad, his mom, and bolted straight toward the flames. Hakama shouted for him to wait and try to grab him. Gene kept his eyes moving. Wooden barricades, wooden buildings. Civilization not particularly advanced. He filed it away and walked in. Inside the village, Hakama suddenly went rigid. Her grandmother, an old woman, was locked in a fight with a small corruptor. Hakama screamed, "Grandma," and sprinted toward her. The grandmother screamed back, asking why she'd come back. Gene looked at the monster. Same as always. Still called corruptors, apparently. Some things don't change. The girl was already gathering energy. She screamed at her grandmother to run, said she wasn't running, she was saving her. Gene clocked the reaction and thought, "Let me confirm something." He moved in instantly, kicked the corruptor clean, and pulled the grandmother out of the way. She started to say something, but Hakama was already pressing the attack. Fire energy pooling in her hands, launching straight into the corruptor. It took the hit and went down. The other two came running over. Nanomachine-based regeneration suppression. The corruptor showed no signs of healing. And that fire attack, Hakama was pulling from the nanomachines in the atmosphere. But nanomachines should only respond to compatible individuals. Gene asked the grandmother straight, "That fireball, could everyone in this era do that?" The grandmother blinked at this era, then said, "No, only some of them. Divine power, they called it. In this village, only 4 people had it, including herself. Divine power. So, that's what they were calling the ability to control nanomachines." Hakama ran to her grandmother and asked about everyone else. The grandmother said she'd already evacuated them, and then immediately asked why Hakama had come back. Because the village was already finished. That corruptor was just a newborn larva. The main body was something they couldn't handle, and soon the larvae would swarm the place in huge numbers. Then a voice cut through, "Don't show weakness, old lady." A young man strode and holding a spear. This was Salus, and he had a friend with him. Salus announced he'd kill the corruptor himself. The grandmother asked about the villagers. He said he'd already sent them to shelter. And then Hakama came sprinting past, everyone straight toward the man beside Salus, screaming, "Dad." Her father grabbed her, asked where she'd been, said he'd been worried sick. Hakama told him she'd gone to the sealed door. The grandmother's expression shifted immediately. She asked how Hakama could have gone to that forbidden place. Hakama, a little nervous, explained. The grandmother had told her once that behind that door was the guardian god of the village, and that when danger came it would help them. The grandmother turned and looked at Jean. This man doesn't look like a god at all. Salas scoffed. Hakima's father looked equally confused. Salas said the idea of an inferior species being the guardian god was laughable. Jean caught the words inferior species, but said nothing yet. The little boy, who'd been running with Hakima, came forward and told Salas that Jean had actually defeated a corruptor. Salas asked where the boy had even been, realized he'd been with Hakima, then stepped directly up to Jean and laid it out mockingly. No animal ears, no beast power, just an inferior species who happened to be in the right place. The larva kill was nothing. Salas said he could do the same in one hit. Then he pointed a spear at Jean and told him plainly this was their village's problem. Outsiders weren't welcome, and Jean should stay out of it. Hakima's father told Salas to hold on and asked where he was going. Salas said it was obvious. He was going to kill the huge corruptor. He glanced back once and told everyone else to stay there trembling if they wanted. The grandmother muttered that fool under her breath. If he ran, he might at least survive. Jean looked at the worried faces around him. The grandmother stepped up to him. She didn't know who he was but thanked him for helping earlier. She asked if he'd be willing to escort her son and the children to the shelter. Then she steeled herself and said she'd follow Salas and take her chances. Hakima screamed Grandma. Jean turned around and said, I refuse. Then added, I have my pride too. He wasn't going to let someone call him an inferior species and then just walk off to die. Hakima lit up like he'd said the greatest thing she'd ever heard. Somewhere else, a giant creature hauled itself out of a lake. It growled and scanned its surroundings, and standing right in front of it was Salas. He was not intimidated at all. Salas released thunder energy from his spear and announced with full confidence and zero self-awareness that he was the man who had carried this country on his back. He struck a fighting pose, declared he would become a holy knight, promised he would take down this invader himself. The creature looked at him with what could only be described as disappointment. Salas attacked anyway. The monster roared. In the chaos, Salas carved through several of its underlings in quick succession, slicing them clean through the middle, shouting at them to get out of his way. He leapt, launched a full power strike straight at the main body's head, and landed, smug, satisfied, already assuming it was over. The monster was visibly damaged. Salas crossed past it. Then the wound started closing. Salas stared. The monster healed in an instant, and before he could process it, a massive claw was already coming down at him. He threw his hand up to shield himself, and then Jean stepped in between them and blocked it. He told Salas, better now? Salas shouted, then had to immediately dodge sideways as another underling came at him from a different angle. He dispatched it, still processing what had just happened. Jean, entirely unbothered, drew one hand out of his pocket, pointed two fingers at a pair of underlings, and with a single shot dropped both of them simultaneously. Salas stared at the scene and said, what the? Then the villagers arrived. Hakima shouted for them to come over. Hurry. Hakima's father came in beside her grandmother, both of them stunned. The grandmother looked at Jean, one hand out holding back the monster's strike without flinching, and couldn't form a complete thought. Jean, for his part, said the strategy was working, but it was starting to get heavy. Tom pulled back for now. Salas didn't understand what was happening, but Jean didn't wait for him to catch up. He grabbed Salas under one arm, launched them both off the ground mid-attack, and landed away from the monster before setting him down. Salas asked what exactly Jean was. He pointed out that no matter how much damage you dealt, these things regenerated immediately. Jean replied that was exactly why you needed nanomachines, to suppress the regeneration. Then mentioned the last attack was good, but it hadn't gone deep enough to stop it. Salas asked, confused, nanomachines? Jean told him that's what he and everyone else called divine power. Salas stared at him and asked, genuinely thrown, are you really the guardian god? Jean said he didn't remember becoming a god. Then he stood up, moved forward, and glanced sideways at Salas. He brought up the earlier comment about this being a village problem, right? Salas started to confirm it. That's why Jean cut him off, said that wasn't right, then turned to face the monster directly and said formally and plainly, this is my problem. The monster growled and attacked. Jean started moving through the strikes, thinking as he went, first, immobilize it. He used a skill converting the lake's water into ice crystals and locking the monster's attacking tentacles in place. The creature was trapped. Jean looked at it and said these things existed because humanity had been foolish. He charged power into his hand and walked forward across the water surface, pointed his hand straight at the monster, said that since he'd lived 100 million years ago as well, he was the one who had to settle this. Salas said he didn't understand any of that, but asked straight, could he actually do it? Jean said yes, and then his mind went somewhere else for a moment. Countless experiments, brutal and tragic and blood-soaked history stretching back further than anyone alive could imagine. He was the result of all of it, the last human ever created. He fired. The blast hit the monster so hard the water erupted into massive waves on all sides. The monster had no time to react. Its entire upper body, everything above the waterline, was incinerated on contact. The attack kept going, punching clean through the atmosphere and splitting into open space, clearing every cloud in the area on its way out. What was left of the monster sat half dead in the water. The villagers stood in total silence. Hakama immediately lit up with joy. Salis was somewhere past shock, just staring. Jean looked at what remained and said, "Scientific weapon." That's what he was. In the bushes nearby, a girl had been watching the whole thing. She'd come to investigate reports of new invaders appearing near Podima village. She'd ended up seeing something else entirely. She adjusted her glasses, eyes fixed on Jean standing among the villagers, and thought about what she'd just witnessed. Even the holy knight captain of the royal capital couldn't have done something like that. Her eyes lit up. She made her decision immediately. They had to return to the royal capital right now. Later that night, Jean stood alone in the forest. He held up the Rubik's Cube. It began to project an image, and then his friend's voice came through, cutting across 100 million years like it was nothing. "Can you hear me, Jean? If you're listening to this, I'm probably no longer in this world." A pause. I've always wanted to say that line. Then, so how's it? The future. The global environment should have improved significantly, but there's a problem. Jean went still. A problem? His friend cut straight to it. Even if the world's environment recovered, the corruptors probably wouldn't die out. Something had felt off about 1,000 years after Jean went under. So Kagura had periodically gone into cold sleep himself, waking up at intervals to observe how things were changing. The numbers were dropping with the environment's improvement, yes, but then the satellite camera had caught something. A human-like figure, corruptor energy. And the moment the corruptor spotted the camera, it vanished instantly. Gone. His friend's voice continued. Alongside the environmental changes, corruptors had begun to evolve. He didn't know what form that would take, but they would definitely become a threat. All he could do was tweak the newly emerging life forms, give them just enough to fight back, and leave something behind for Jean. Jean said, "Power?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the injection. His friend confirmed it. Once injected, the nanomachines would show him how to use it, a power only Jean could wield because he was 100% compatible. Jean injected it without hesitating. Energy surged through his body, intense, immediate, and then settled. He opened his palm. A knife materialized in his hand. Nanomachine, shape-shifting, generating physical objects. He turned it over and thought, pretty handy. His friend kept going. He'd hidden power-ups in research labs scattered across the world, deliberately split up so that if corruptors found one location, they couldn't destroy everything at once. And also, he admitted because he wanted Jean to travel, to actually see the world. Jin's eyes widened slightly. The recording continued over a cut to elsewhere in the forest, a knight and a princess traveling through the trees. The girl who'd been watching the fight earlier suddenly appeared, running toward the knight, laughing loudly. And somewhere else entirely, in a library inside a town, another girl sat quietly reading. His friend's voice, meanwhile, kept going. Compared to the world of the past, it should be much better now. And as he said it, the figure in the recording was visibly aging, older with each passing second. He said he'd seen it through to the end. He was leaving the world in Jin's hands. The hologram disappeared. Jean said, "Understood." 2 seconds later, Hakama and Dampu came crashing through the trees. Hakama said, "There you are," like she'd been personally wronged by his absence. Dampu reported that everyone had been looking for him. They each grabbed one of his hands, and Hakama announced they couldn't start without the star of the show. Jean noticed something, a key attached to Hakama's locket, a lab access key. He asked her where she'd gotten the pendant. She said a great person had entrusted it to her clan a long time ago. It had been passed down through generations as a charm. They were told that when danger came to the village, as long as they had it, the guardian deity would protect them. Jean put it together. That's how she'd been able to get inside. He owed them enormously and hadn't even known it. They returned to the village where a celebration was already underway. Not everyone was immediately on board. However, a few voices cut through the noise. Is that really the guardian god? No way. He's clearly an inferior species. That scrawny guy actually defeated it? Then Salis released a pulse of power that shut the whole crowd up immediately. He punched one of the loud mouths and shouted that they'd run away, so they wouldn't know what happened. Shandy, Salis' little brother, apologized on his behalf. Salis kept going, loudly declaring that the guardian deity was incredible, demanding to know how anyone could doubt it. Danka smiled and noted they were completely different people compared to that afternoon. Then Hakama's grandmother appeared. Hakama's father was with her. The grandmother said she wanted to express the village's gratitude formally, and Hakuma's father placed a hand over his chest and said plainly, if Jean hadn't been there, the village would be gone. They wanted to repay that. Jean told them not to worry about it. Hakuma's grandmother started to insist. Jean cut her off and said if they really wanted to do something, skip the goods. He wanted information, the detailed current state of the world. The grandmother thought for a moment, then told him, go to the royal capital. That was where the king of Kormoja resided, and since people gathered there from all over the country, it would be the best place to learn about the state of things. The people of Kodama village visited frequently themselves. They sold goods made from silkworm thread there. The journey was long and dangerous, she said, but the guardian deity should be fine. Jean pointed out he had no idea where it was. The grandmother immediately patted Hakuma on the head and said, use Hakuma as your guide. The girl had business in the royal capital anyway. Jean asked what business. The grandmother said she assumed he'd noticed Hakuma could wield divine power. In the royal capital, there was an academy dedicated to developing exactly that. Salus shouted that he was the one who should be guiding the guardian god. The grandmother asked what business he had in the capital. He said he was going there to join the Holy Knights. She told him flatly that he couldn't even get into the academy. There was no way they'd take him. Salus got red in the face and told her to say that again. Old hag. Jean cut in and asked, so, just having divine power wasn't enough to get in? Hakuma said there was a more demanding exam, then added that Salus was an idiot, so he'd failed it. Jean said, I see, and thought, still the Holy Knights. I'm a little curious about them. Elsewhere in the forest, Argus was already moving. The girl who'd watched the entire fight from the bushes told him the giant corruptor that had appeared near Kodama village had been defeated. Argus asked if that was really true. She said, yes, absolutely true, and that she was on her way back to report it to the guild master right now. Argus thought, I came here assuming not even a holy knight could handle it, so I rushed over without waiting for the guild's report. I never imagined it would already be down. The girl muttered to herself about the crazy coincidence of running into a holy knight out here in the middle of the forest. She didn't notice the corruptor coming up directly behind her. Argus did. He sliced it apart in one motion before it could reach her, then said calmly, if what she was saying was true, this was very interesting. Argus smiled and said he wanted to meet this person himself, and the next morning arrived clean and fresh. Jean stepped outside and just stood there. The air tasted good, greenery everywhere, a river moving in the distance, mountains rising behind it all. He thought about how he never imagined a day like this would come, and then thought about Kagura, and wished he could have shown him this. Then someone came sprinting toward him with his clothes, screaming, Guardian God, please, your clothes. Jean had walked outside naked again. He got dressed, and they prepared to leave. As the two of them set off, the grandmother pulled Hakuma aside and told her to properly fulfill her role as guide. Hakuma agreed immediately. Salus, standing nearby, said grumpily that he'd been hoping to stay at Jin's side and learn from him. The grandmother told him to study first. Salus told her to shut up. Jean glanced over at him and said his movements yesterday hadn't been bad. He'd be waiting for him in the royal capital. Salus completely fell apart. He pulled the most overwhelmed expression he had ever made in his life, started crying, and shouted that he'd work hard at his studies. Jean raised a hand in acknowledgement and kept walking. Hakuma's father shook Jin's hand and asked him to take good care of her, then turned to Hakuma and told her to take care of her health. She said, yeah, called out that she was off, and the two of them waved back at the village and left. They walked, and Hakuma talked, pointing out landmarks, noting places here and there. By evening, they stopped at a waterfall. Hakuma drank, pointed ahead, and they kept moving. By night, they had a fire going. Hakuma asked how far it was to the royal capital. Jean asked between sips of water. She said, still eating, another 4 days on foot. Jean said that was surprisingly close. Hakuma asked why he wanted to know about the world. Jean said it was a secret. She repeated the word like she was tasting it, then let it go. Jean went quiet. His mind turned over what he knew. Corruptors hadn't gone extinct. Kagura had said so. They existed in this era, but corruptors should only be able to breed in heavily polluted environment. Something was changing. Something was definitely wrong underneath the surface. Hakuma interrupted his thoughts. She told him he was making a scary face. Jean said sorry. He was just thinking, then filed it away for later. There were people living in this era, not dominated by corruptors. First priority, understand how they lived. Corruptors could be investigated after that. He told Hakuma she could stop calling him Guardian God. She asked what she should call him instead. Jean. Just Jean. She tried Jean-sama. He said, drop the sama too. Just Jean. Then hoofbeats. A knight on horseback came to a stop nearby and apologized for interrupting their rest. He asked if he could have a moment. Jean looked him over, strange ears, formal armor, and asked who he was. The knight introduced himself, Argus Walton, captain of the 7th Division of the Royal Capital Holy Knight Order. Holy Knights. Jean filed that away, too. Hakama looked at them and thought, are these the ones? Then a girl's voice cut in, sharp, already furious. She was on horseback beside the captain, and she was not pleased with Jean sitting down, unbothered energy. She told him to stand up, called his attitude insolent, and announced this was disrespectful to a captain. The knight captain got down from his horse and told her, Karina, to stop. He apologized to Jean for speaking from horseback and asked if they'd be willing to talk. Jean said, definitely these guys, under his breath. The captain explained his subordinate had been rude, and he apologized for that first, but he had questions. Where had they come from, and where were they headed? Hakama answered, Kodama village, heading to the royal capital. The captain's expression shifted slightly. Karina immediately dismounted again and drew her sword. She announced there were no records of inferior species being born in Kodama village. They'd slipped up. Jean thought, birth record, pretty organized country. The captain stopped Karina before she could go further. He pointed out that the clothes Hakama was wearing were Kodama village's specialty, high-quality thread goods that traded at significant prices even in the royal capital, and that children from Kodama village rarely appeared on the market. Her story checked out. Karina stared at him. The captain turned his sword toward Jean. Different story. Unfamiliar clothes. Nothing from anywhere on the route between Kodama village and the royal capital. And that route had seen frequent bandit incidents lately. Criminals using children to carry stolen cargo, operating under the appearance of being harmless travelers. Jean instantly stood up and said that wasn't them. The knight said they would be the ones making that judgment. Hakama activated her divine power. The captain glanced at her, and in the same instant, countless energy forms, swords materialized around her, all pointed directly at her. The captain told her calmly not to try anything foolish. Hakama looked around at the blades and went very still. The captain noted she had divine power, said she seemed promising. Jean looked at the formation and thought, so these are the Holy Knights. They're strong. The captain turned his sword back to Jean, told him to answer. Where did he come from? Depending on the answer, he said he would cut him down right there. Jean looked up at him. The expression on his face was so calm, it was almost unsettling. And he said calmly, he came from Kodala village. Karina looked like she'd been slapped. The captain sheathed his sword. She asked him what he was doing. The captain looked at Hakama and said, you're not lying, are you? Hakama told him Jean was the guardian deity of Kodama village. The captain turned that over in his head, guardian god, and said he understood. Jean asked if they were done. The captain said, yeah, and started getting back on his horse. He apologized for the rudeness. Occupational hazard, he said, asked if Jean was also heading to the royal capital. Jean confirmed it. The captain said they'd likely meet again, and that if Jean ever ran into trouble, he should come find him. He called it debt for the inconvenience. The captain told her to drop it, turned his horse, and left. Karina stared after him, absolutely baffled, and then shouted at his back the whole way out. Once they were away from the camp, Karina demanded to know why he'd backed down. The man was clearly suspicious, an inferior species, no less. The captain rode in silence for a moment, then said he wondered which one of them was actually the inferior species. Karina went quiet. A third member of their group, who had been silent until now, said that was true, then asked if neither of them had noticed the difference in power between them and Jean. The captain said he had attacked 3 times in the past, as in it had already happened without anyone seeing it. Each time before he could even follow through, he'd been neutralized. Jean had been running power constantly through his hands inside his pockets the entire conversation. Karina asked if he'd used divine power. He said, yes. It hadn't even activated. Just nothing. Karina looked like the world had shifted slightly under her feet. The captain continued. He'd tried the same against Jean as he had against Hakama, but the spirits hadn't responded at all. The third member said the same had happened to her. Karina started to piece it together. The captain finished the thought. There was a massive gap in base divine power. Someone capable of that among all the Holy Knights would only be the Grand Captain. Both of them stared. Karina said she hadn't noticed anything, not even a flicker. The captain said Jean was just too much of an anomaly. He reminded Karina she'd only just joined the squad. She couldn't have been expected to catch it. Then asked her, the corruptor incident in Kodama village, did you think it was him? She said it likely was, then asked if they could really just leave him alone. Wasn't that dangerous? The captain said he didn't know Jin's origins, but he hadn't seemed like a threat. For now, they'd keep an eye on him. More immediately, they needed to return to the royal capital. The corruptor incident had wrapped up early, but they couldn't stay out any longer. He'd arranged the bandit situation through the guild. The senior member started telling Karina something about composure and dignity as they rode. The captain, meanwhile, thought about the guardian deity of Kodama village and what it might mean if someone like that became an ally, given the problems this country was currently facing. The next morning, Jean and Hakama kept moving. Jean said he'd met someone interesting the day before. He asked if all the knights in the royal capital had that level of ability. Hakama said that was a special case. Among knights, only the elite were gathered into the Holy Knights, and that captain's spirit magic activation speed had been on a completely different level. She demonstrated with some hand gestures that made Jean look at her sideways. Spirit magic, she explained, was the technique activated using divine power, the power borrowed from spirits. Jean thought, nanomachines treated as spirits. Science become fantasy. He filed it away and kept walking. His mind drifted to Karina's inferior species line. He brought it up, asked what that was about. Hakama said there were all kinds of species in this era. Some close to fish, some close to insects. A long time ago, she explained, there were only limited places where people could survive, and over time, everyone changed into whatever was suited to their region. Jean thought about it. Adapted to the environment. Does that mean some humans actually survived 1,000,000 years ago and evolved? He let the thought go. No use chasing it now. He asked, so, the ones that didn't change became the inferior species? Hakama said yes. Compared to those who adapted, they were inferior in many ways. That was why the world treated them coldly. Many inferior species were also sold into slavery. Jean thought, they're slaves. Hakama said there wasn't actually that much difference between them. It was strange to treat someone differently just because they were a little different. She said everyone was crazy. Jean told her she was a good person. They kept walking. Then a voice cut across the road. Help me. A child stumbled out and collapsed in front of them. Hakama immediately went to him and asked if he was okay. Jean looked at the child carefully. Human ears, no animal features, not even a trace. He registered that instantly. The child lying in front of them looked half dead. Hakama ran straight to her. Jean looked the girl over and thought, covered in bruises, injuries this bad were serious. Hakama lifted her slightly off the ground and asked if she was okay. Jean released power into his hand and told her to hang on. He'd heal her right now. The child's eyes snapped open. She shoved a dagger against Hakama's throat in an instant, pulling her as a shield, and screamed at Jean not to move or she'd kill her. The tension spiked. Jean went still and thought, I see. He said out loud, too. They'd walked right into a trap. He scanned the surroundings and thought, which means there are others nearby. Sure enough, a figure shimmered into visibility nearby. Jean thought, stealth camouflage, a nanomachine function that takes in surrounding visuals and renders the user transparent. Breaks if they move. Used well. The man appeared fully and praised the child. Called her by name, told her she'd done exactly what she was told. Then he pointed a sword at Jean and asked with complete contempt, what country an inferior species wearing such unusual clothes was from. Two underlings moved in to flank Jean. One told him not to move. Hakama shouted Jin's name. The bandit reminded her what happened if Jean moved. Hakama started gathering power in her hand anyway, furious, barely holding it. Jean immediately called her name. She stopped and looked at him. He said that power of hers wasn't meant to be used on people, and she knew that. She said, but the bandit leader's eyes lit up. He said, jackpot. Hadn't expected her to have divine power, too. One of the underlings noted Jean might have it as well. Jean said, who knows? The bandit leader kicked Jean in the stomach. Hakama screamed. The underlings told the inferior species to stop acting tough. The leader told them not to damage the merchandise. The underling pointed out inferior species didn't sell for much anyway. The leader reminded him Jean might have divine power. Hakama watched the whole exchange and put it together. These were the bandits the Holy Knight had mentioned, slave traders. The bandit leader moved toward Hakama, a power already forming in his hand, and said she was going to take a little nap. Hakama thought, if we get caught, we'll be sold off. The hand came close, and then her eyes closed. Hakama, wake up. Jin's voice. Her eyes opened. They were in a cage. Jean was sitting beside her with his upper body completely bare, asking if she was okay. She said she was fine, then asked where they were. He looked around and explained this was the bandits' base. Everyone they'd ambushed had been brought here. Around them, other cages held people in rough shape, starving, shaking, hollow-eyed. Hakama went quiet looking at them. Then she asked why Jean was half naked. He said they'd taken his clothes because they were unusual. At least they'd left the underwear. She told him he was way too calm about this. He said he'd spent most of his life naked. She stared at him. Then she asked the more important question. Why hadn't he fought back? He could have taken him out easily. Jean went silent. As if on cue, the door opened. The child from earlier walked in with one of the bandits, who told them to just get it over with. Jean watched. The child looked at him. said, "So you're awake," and started pushing food through to them. She said she didn't mind if they hated her. She hadn't expected to be forgiven anyway. Hakama moved toward the bars, furious. Jean said, "You're too kind." The child asked what that meant. Jean said thieves didn't waste time wondering whether they'd be hated or forgiven. They just took. He stood up, grabbed both bars of the cage, and tore it apart like it was nothing. Stepped out, dusted off his hands. The child froze in terror. Jean said he'd been waiting for her to come. No one else could overhear them here. Then he asked, where are they keeping the person the child cared about? The child stared at him, asked how he'd known. Jean let a bit of power flow into his hand and said it was simple deduction. The injuries had been real. He'd confirmed that immediately. But even people like these wouldn't hurt their own ally that badly, just to use them as bait. He pressed his hand to the child and healed her in an instant, then said he'd figured it out quickly enough. The child was only doing what they said because they were holding something over her. The child's expression crumbled. She started trembling, said it was her little brother. They had him, told him if she resisted, they'd sell the brother off to another country, separate them for life. And then it all came out at once. The child shouting through tears. Her mother and father had been killed by these people, but she had to protect her brother. That's why. Jin's fist tightened, then tightened further. Hakama said softly. He let himself get captured on purpose to save her. Jin got his composure back and said that was part of it. But people like this were stubborn, clingy like oil stains, he said. Even if one got away, they'd rebuild somewhere else and go right back to it. Hakama asked, oil stains? He said if you're going to wipe them out, you did it from the root, completely, no exceptions. Outside the door, the bandit waiting in the hall had gone quiet and was listening carefully. Jean walked to the door and kicked it clean off its hinges. The door, and the bandit stuck to it, went flying. He stepped through the opening, power radiating off him in waves, and said it clearly, all the way through, thoroughly. Jin's mind drifted back 100 million years. When it came to scum, he knew them better than anyone. Civilization had been modern once. Jean, still a child, had admired justice the way kids do. Saw a news report about a hero busting a brutal drug ring and thought it was the greatest thing. Then a car pulled up behind him. A few men climbed out looking for trouble. One grabbed Jean by the collar and lifted him clean off the ground. Jean thought, if you can live an ordinary life, that's obviously the best. But the moment he'd been born into never allowed that. His face was expressionless even then. He twisted the man's arm free of his collar, and what followed after that could only be called a massacre. He dismantled them, hit their base, destroyed every single one of them. Sat on top of the pile afterwards like he was waiting for a bus. That was when someone walked up and told him, you were born in the wrong world. His scientist friend from a long time ago. Back in the present, Jean, still in just his underwear, which at this point was practically a uniform, dragged a bandit across the floor by his hair. Two more stepped out ahead of him, shouting for him to stop. Jean had already left a trail of crushed bodies behind him. On the way over, they demanded to know what he wanted, how he'd gotten in. Jean gave them a smirk. He threw the bandit he was dragging directly into them. One caught the body instinctively, and in that same instant, Jean was already on the other one. By the time the first bandit processed what had happened to his friend, Jean had already finished with him, too. The second one hit the floor and managed one last, "Who are you?" before he stopped being a problem. From inside the locked chamber, everyone heard only screaming. The child who'd lured them into the trap, who'd held the dagger to Hakama's throat, stood completely still, listening. She asked Hakama what exactly her partner was. Hakama said, the guardian god? The child asked the god. She said yes, a god. As long as they left it to Jean, they'd be fine. She told the child to do exactly what Jean had said and get everyone outside. The child thought about the bandit leader. The man had insanely strong divine power. There was no way brute force beat that. But then heard the leader's voice from the next room, begging. The leader was shouting at Jean, asking what he wanted. Money? He said embarrassingly, slaves, maybe? He pointed at 3 children kept beside him, offering them up while Jean methodically beat his men around him. He said Jean could have as many as he wanted. Jean glanced at the slaves, then at the leader, asked if he was done talking. The leader's mind was unraveling. His spirit arts weren't activating. They simply weren't responding. He looked at Jean, closing the distance between them, and couldn't understand what kind of power this was. Jean stepped right up to him face to face and said lucky for him, he was only thug. The real ones bolted the second things went south. The leader's expression was worth documenting. Jean told him people like him always started by looking down on their target, convincing themselves it was fine, and the moment they started losing, they started groveling. The leader was drenched in sweat. His legs were shaking. And then something shifted in his eyes, a desperate calculation, and he bolted for a lever on the wall, yanked it down. A gate opened. A cage dropped. Inside, a corruptor? Jean looked at it and thought, a corruptor? The leader said he'd acquired this particular one by a special request from someone. The corruptors stepped out, energy radiating off it in waves. The leader said if groveling wouldn't work, then fine, he'd wreck everything Jean had. The corruptor roared and launched itself forward. Jean didn't move. He blocked the strike cleanly and held it. The leader started despairing again immediately. Jean, holding the corruptor's attack back with one arm, said he'd been born with what they'd call a superhuman body, several times the usual muscle fiber density of a normal human. And on top of that, when it came to corruptors specifically, he didn't hold back on divine power. He drove a straight punch into the corruptor's stomach. It went flying. He raised one arm, pointed it, and released a concentrated burst of holy energy that burned the corruptor into nothing. The bandit leader hit the floor. He looked up at Jean. He can use divine power, too. And then Jean was standing over him asking, "So, what's the next move?" The leader started stammering, asked if there was any chance at all, Jean would let him walk away. Jean punched him in the face before he could finish the sentence. The leader's face met the floor and stayed there. Jean pulled his clothes back on and said, "All right." He glanced back at the bandit leader's thoroughly rearranged face and then looked at the captive children still waiting. He told them sorry. He needed a moment before getting everyone out. He wanted to check a few things first. He moved to the desk and started going through the papers. What really mattered was catching proof of their crimes. He pulled open a drawer, found something inside, and sat on the edge of the table to look closer. Then he thought, "This reeks." Then, "I can't read a single word of this." The language was completely foreign. He'd have to ask Hakama to teach him to read. He filed that away and moved on, heading toward the leftover body parts of the corruptor. He looked at them and thought, what exactly were they planning by capturing a live one? Time to find out. He released his energy into the remains. System readouts appeared in front of him. He accessed the cameras on the nanomachines floating in the area, up to a week of stored footage. He closed his eyes and focused. What he saw made him go very still. The bandit leader standing with someone else entirely, a lord. The leader asking what they were doing capturing something like that. The lord saying he didn't need to know, but offering one thing. Very soon something interesting was going to happen in this country. Something perfect. The lord's face, as he said it, looked like a man who'd been planning something for a long time and was finally watching it arrive. Jean opened his eyes. He was furious. The captives came out of the hideout one after another. Someone directed them on which way to go. And then the child from earlier, the one who'd been used as bait, came running out and found his little brother waiting for him. He screamed Nino. The brother screamed Big Sis. They crashed into each other and held on. She kept saying thank goodness over and over. She turned to Jean and thanked him deeply. Jean said he was no god, but told her not to worry about it. Then asked, the ones arresting the bandits, were they from this lord's domain? Hakama said no, guild staff. She called them. The guild master of the town was already on site, a large man with buffalo horns on his head. Jean looked at him and said, I see. The guild master came straight over and confirmed Jean was the one behind all this. Jean said yes. The guild master, Padrak, and his members bowed immediately. He thanked Jean for handling that many enemies and then studied him carefully thinking, looks like a lesser species, but instincts say otherwise. Padrak explained they'd had damage reports piling up and bandit extermination requests coming in without stop. Jean asked if the lord wasn't the one commanding their capture. Padrak almost laughed. Lords didn't have that authority. Dealing with crimes was the guild's job, sworn to the king directly. Even if Lord Shapian, who governed this land, committed a crime, they were duty-bound to report it to the king. Not that Padrak thought he ever would, he added. Jean thought it over. In old world terms, lord is the mayor, guild is the police. But still, Shapian. He handed over the papers he'd found. Padrak opened them, and his expression shifted immediately. A complete list of everyone who'd done business with the bandit. With this, he said they could round them up one by one. Jean casually asked if the lord's name was on there. Padrak told him very seriously not to take his jokes literally. Of course it wasn't. Jean thought, quite the villain. Nothing he could do about that right now. He turned to the two siblings and asked the guild master what would happen to the freed slaves. Padrak said those with family or search requests would be returned safely. The ones with neither, the guild couldn't do anything for them. Jean looked at the two kids. He remembered their parents had been killed by these people. He asked if there were any shelters. Padrak said none. They could help find work, but since the two were lesser species, that would be difficult. Jean let out a slow breath. Lesser species again. He wanted to do something for them, but without somewhere willing to take them in. Then something clicked. He asked them if there were a place that could use both of them. Would they go? Both kids looked up at him immediately. The little one started nodding before the question was even finished. The older one asked if he had somewhere in mind. Jean said he did. He thought back to the Holy Knight Captain's words, if you ever run into trouble, come find me. He said he knew the perfect workplace. The scene shifted to the royal capital, Kalmusia, Argus's state. The captain suddenly flinched on horseback. Karina asked if something was wrong. He said it was nothing, just a sudden chill. He dismounted, told her that would be all. Good work on the expedition. Take the day to rest. And walked inside with a briefcase. The staff welcomed him home. He handed the briefcase to his butler without a word. The butler exchanged a quiet look with the maid. Argus said something had happened. The butler bowed and apologized for bringing it up while he was tired, then leaned in and whispered in his ear. From a balcony above, a girl watched. Argus straightened up, thanked the butler for the report, and pressed a hand to his head. Things are worse than I thought. Corruptors appearing in the capital itself. How did they get in? He thought again. No, more likely someone let them in on purpose. If that was the case, the most suspicious place was Harness Academy, the one that stubbornly refused to allow any outsiders in under any circumstances. He was going to need allies, fast. Back with Jean, he was leaving the area with Hakama, the older child, and the little brother in tow. 3 days after the bandit raid, Jean walked with Hakama and the child. Her name turned out to be Fogel, toward the capital. Fogel asked Jean if he really thought there was work in the capital for someone like her. Jean listed it out plainly. She could read, she could write, she was good at math. She'd find something. Have some confidence. Fogel immediately overcorrected and said okay with perhaps too much enthusiasm. Then Hakama pointed ahead and said she could see it. Jean looked. So, this is the capital? From the cliff's edge, the whole city spread out below them. They entered and Fogel spun around, taking everything in, visibly overwhelmed. Hakama had been here several times. She took on the tour guide role naturally, pointing out that the capital imported almost everything. So, goods came in from across the country. People from Kodama village came to sell their specialties here, too. Jean said she'd mentioned that before, but he was looking around as he said it, quietly cataloging all kinds of races and cultures gathered in one place. A genuinely unique development. Streets were clean. Public order looked reasonable. But problems existed. He glanced aside, 2 people, clearly poor, being shoved around by someone with authority. Jean thought, in every era. He asked Hakama when the entrance exam for the academy was. She said next week. Just beside them, a girl overheard this and went quietly, visibly furious. Jean said they had a bit of time then. Hakama confirmed enrollment came right after the exam. The girl standing nearby processed what she'd heard and thought. Enrolling in Harness Academy? A kid and a lesser species like those two. Something about it made her look like she'd bitten into something sour. Later that day, the group arrived at a hotel and got settled in. Jean looked around at the room and said they finally had a proper place to sleep. Hakama agreed. Jean sat and thought through his situation. He was in the capital as planned. Now what? He looked at the gold coins he'd received as a reward from the guild for clearing out the bandits. Whatever he chose to do next, he needed money to function in this era. The reward wouldn't last forever, especially after sharing it with the freed slaves. He looked at Fogel and her brother. He still needed to sort out work for them. The Holy Knight captain would be the fastest route, but without a proper connection, he couldn't exactly knock on the man's door. He stood up and looked out the window. First priority, research the corruptors of this era, especially since someone was already trying to exploit them for unclear purpose. Corruptors were not something he could leave unmonitored. He looked down at the city below and thought, I won't let this era repeat what happened to mine. He turned from the window and asked Hakama, when people in this country needed to look something up, what did they do? She said they asked someone or read books. Books were expensive, but in Kodama village, they all shared. The capital had a library, though. He could research there. Jean thought, convenient. He might even find clues to the labs Kagura had left behind. The next morning at the library, the attendant stopped Jean at the door. Books were national property, she explained. Not just anyone could come and go. Access was limited to students officially recognized by the academy, faculty, and nobles living in the capital. Jean let out a slow breath and said, I see. Hakama pointed out, perhaps unnecessarily, that Jean couldn't read yet anyway. Jean thought, right, I still can't. Hakama's been teaching me, but I need more time. He pressed a hand to his forehead. Then, from just behind him, a voice said, That's them, right? The other replied, Group of lesser species with kids. That's them. One stepped forward and threw a punch directly at Jin's face. Jean caught it before it landed. He said, Nice way to say hello. He thought the city had decent public order. The attacker said that was just a misunderstanding and started charging power into his hand. Before he could release it, Jean raised one hand and the attack redirected straight up into the sky, blasting upward harmlessly. The attacker told Jean he had sharp eyes for an old man. Fogel stared. They were using divine power in the middle of the street. Jean asked both of them what they wanted. One said their client found Jean an eyesore. Jean thought, hired? Actually, that saves me some trouble. The first one stepped forward and offered a deal. Disappear from the capital, and Jean wouldn't face danger every day. To make the point, he attacked. Jean was already beside him before the punch arrived. He blocked it, grabbed the attacker, and put him on the floor hard. Asked, is that so? The man let out a scream. The second one charged a fireball immediately and launched it. Jean blocked it. Smoke filled the space between them. The attacker smirked, assuming he'd connected. Jin's hand came through the smoke, grabbed the boy by the collar, and lifted him into the air. Jean told him, if he wanted to be a real threat, he should come back considerably stronger. He said in a way that made the boy go very still midair. Added, almost pleasantly, that he assumed he'd have the guts to try again. The boy thought, he's not a lesser species. Then a new voice cut through everything. That's enough. Nobody move. It was the Holy Knight captain's subordinate. Not Karina, the other one. She was supposed to be enjoying a day off and was visibly annoyed about how it was going. She leveled her spear at the group and announced she would put every last one of them in a cell. She moved toward Jean to follow through on that. Jean said, good thing they made a spectacle of it on purpose. She stopped, looked at him properly, then shouted, you're that lesser species from before. The girl told Jean it was him again, gave a smirk, and pointed her spear at him. Said it figured. Lesser species causing trouble the moment they arrived in the capital. Mocked him for not understanding what he could and couldn't do. Then a lady's voice cut in. She said she just happened to be passing by and had seen everything. The people who'd attacked first were those two, and honestly, what she'd witnessed looked like straightforward self-defense. The Holy Knight's subordinate went quiet. The lady looked at the two boys who'd attacked Jean and said she thought she recognized them. Stepped closer, said they were students at Harness Academy, weren't they? She grabbed her own head, said she just hoped a certain someone wasn't involved. She told her guards to take them away, then muttered, just talking to myself. Don't mind. Before anyone could ask further questions, Jean came closer and asked if she did patrols too. He thought that was the guild's job. She replied that the capital was large. They just helped keep order. She thought to herself, truth is, I was just wandering around looking for food and happened to walk past. She looked at Jean. Even that academy student hadn't been faking his power level, and this man had handled it without effort. She turned to leave and told him to try not to stir up too much trouble in the capital. Jean said, wait. If she didn't mind, there was somewhere he'd like her to show him. She stopped and asked, somewhere he wanted her to take him? That night, Argus' estate. Argus opened the door and said nothing, but the shock was visible. Jean told him he'd said to come find him if they ran into trouble. Remember? Argus noted there were more people than when they'd last met. Jean said it had just turned out that way. They'd run into the bandits Argus had warned them about, and these kids had been prisoners, so they'd gotten them out. Argus asked about the bandits. Jean said he'd given them a bit of a beating and left the rest of the guild. Argus said, I see, and thought he handled it alone, then asked about the children. Jean said they had no family, and they were what this world called lesser species. The least he could do was help them find somewhere to work. Argus told him he wasn't obligated to take responsibility for them. Jean said that was just how he did things. If he was going to save someone, he saw it through to the end. No half measures. Fogel and her brother both looked quietly relieved that Jean existed. Argus said, very well. The two of them could live and work at the estate. Fogel stared. Really? Argus immediately added a condition. If they were working here, he wanted Jean to serve as an instructor. Jean asked, instructor? Shortly after, Fogel and her little brother were dressed in maids' uniforms. Jean told them it suited them. Fogel bowed deeply to Argus and thanked him profusely. Argus told her not to thank him. It was Jean she should thank. He turned to his butler and maid and said he was counting on them to educate the two properly and not to discriminate because they were lesser species. They answered, understood. Jean waved and left with Argus and Hakama. He asked Argus directly, so there was an ulterior motive behind making him an instructor. Argus said he appreciated how quickly Jean caught on. He said he didn't know who Jean really was, but he wanted to believe he was a decent man, and he had a favor to ask. He wanted Jean to infiltrate Harness Academy. Jean asked what he meant. Argus explained the country was currently being targeted by several factions, all competing for control. The king was ill and didn't have long, so the succession battle had already started behind the scenes. But the problem wasn't just the named candidates. There was someone with no claim to the throne at all who was also making a move, and they were using corruptors, dragging innocent people into it. Jean thought, so those people weren't the only ones to watch for. Argus continued, dangerous people were hiding in the capital and operating in the shadows. They needed to expose them as soon as possible. The most suspicious location, Jean finished the sentence for him, was Harness Academy. Argus confirmed it and knocked on a door. said they were going in and that the person inside would help Jean move around within the academy. He introduced her, his little sister who attended Harness Academy, Mira. It was the girl who had been furious overhearing them at the library. The same one who had sent those academy students after Jean. Before Argus could finish his introduction, Mira cut him off and asked her brother, with visible disbelief, if he was seriously putting a lesser species in charge of the academy infiltration. Argus immediately told her that was rude. She said a lesser species being involved at all was the problem. And while she could maybe understand the country girl, this was not a job for someone like Jean. Jean stepped forward and said she was quite the prejudiced young lady. Argus apologized and told Jean not to take it too hard. His subordinate leaned in and whispered that Mira was brilliant, but her bias against lesser species was severe. Jean looked at the subordinate and told her she wasn't much better herself. Mira pointed her paper fan at Jean and addressed her brother directly. She said this wasn't just about sneaking in. They'd have to actually function as a teacher. She didn't believe a lesser species was capable of being an instructor. She asked if Jean even had that kind of talent. Hakama immediately stepped forward and said Jean absolutely could, then caught herself and started talking. Jean told her not to. Too late. Mira said if he couldn't even do that, he wasn't worth discussing as an instructor. Hakama pressed on regardless, saying there was a lot only Jean could teach, that he was far more capable than people like them. Mira looked Jean over properly for the first time, said he at least looked strong enough to keep students in line. She walked past him and added, but being strong alone didn't make someone a teacher. She left. Argus pressed a hand to his head. His subordinate looked at Argus and asked if those academy students earlier had been his doing. Argus apologized to Jean and said he'd speak to Mira properly. Jean told him not to worry about it, then asked what exactly Argus had been planning to have him teach. Argus said, spirit arts. From what he'd observed, Jean was exceptionally skilled. He wanted him to teach the basics, fire, lightning, ice, healing. If he could use even 2 of the 4, that was more than sufficient. Jean asked if that was really all. Argus said that was all, then paused and added, almost carefully, that he wasn't going to suggest Jean could also use the special spirit arts that only a tiny handful of people in the world could wield. Jean thought it over. So there were people counted as exceptional even in this era. He said, interesting, then turned to Argus and said, all right. He'd shake up this era's common sense just a little. Power began radiating off him as he said it. 1 week later, entrance exam day at Harness Academy. Students were filing in for their exams. Hakama was somewhere among them, sitting hers. Jean, meanwhile, walked a corridor deeper inside the academy with Argus, being led by a heavy-set man who thanked them for coming and noted the 7th squad must be especially busy. Argus told them not to think anything of it. It was simply their turn. Jean moved closer to Argus and asked what he meant. Argus explained, once a year, the Holy Knight squads rotated, sending 1 member to serve as a special instructor at the academy. This year, that duty fell to the 7th squad. Jean said, I see, and thought, are you sure I'm the right pick? The heavy-set man glanced at Jean with obvious suspicion, gestured toward a door ahead, and said the headmaster was waiting inside. He opened it. Argus entered and bowed immediately. Said it had been a while. The headmaster looked at him warmly and said not since he'd graduated top of his class. He'd grown into quite the fine man. She said she was grateful he continued to lend his strength. Argus said it was his duty. She mentioned she'd heard plenty of rumors. Sounded like he was getting pulled in and not just fighting corruptors, but also the country's political struggle. The conversation went on for a while. Eventually attention turned to Jean. Argus told the headmaster plainly Jean was more capable than anyone in his 7th squad, at least when it came to combat. The headmaster said if Argus vouched for it, she'd accept that. But still, another instructor standing in the room objected immediately, loudly. Said this prestigious academy had never once permitted a lesser species to teach, and it wasn't a position for the likes of them. Asked if the headmaster intended to disgrace the academy. The headmaster turned to a lord named Ludman and asked his position. Ludman stroked his beard and agreed. Most students came from noble families, and a lesser species teaching would create backlash from students and faculty alike. The headmaster said there it was. Truth be told, she felt much the same. But she'd hear from Jean as well. Jean stepped forward, gave a proper introduction. Jean from Kodama village, and apologized for the late greeting. The headmaster noted internally that he was remarkably composed for someone who'd just been insulted to his face. Jean said he understood the concern completely. Was a lesser species unfit to teach because of what they were or because they lacked ability? The headmaster said naturally it was the latter. If someone had ability, the rest didn't matter. Jean said then test him. Out on the spirit arts training ground, all 5 of them stood in the open air. Lord Guetia positioned himself across from Jean. The headmaster laid out the rules. Simple. Jean would fight one of their instructors. Combat skill was the fastest measure of ability. Students passing by in the corridor noticed the gathering and started watching. One said they'd never actually seen Goetia fight before. Mira observed from nearby, without a word. Argus stood to the side and thought, this is the first time I'll actually see him fight properly. Lesser species have weaker bodies. Even with divine power, the gap is usually obvious. I hope my judgment wasn't wrong. The headmaster said, let's see how far a lesser species can really go. Goetia asked if Jean was ready, then didn't wait for the answer. He launched a fire attack immediately. Jean dodged it cleanly. The watching students reacted with surprise. Goetia thought, a few of them are watching. Then charged thunder arrows and fired them in rapid succession toward Jean. Jean dodged those too, and the next. Goetia looked at him moving and thought, all you can do is run, lesser species. I may not have made it as a holy knight, but I graduated top of this academy. He pressed forward with another fire attack. Someone like him wasn't someone a lesser species could defeat. Jean, still dodging, thought, I really hate using this power on people, but I suppose I don't have a choice. He landed, lifted one arm, said, I'll show you just a little. Energy gathered not around Jean, but directly above Goetia. The pressure slammed down instantly. Goetia was driven flat against the ground, pinned to it, the floor cracking underneath him under the weight. The headmaster stared. The heavy-set man stared. Everyone stared. Even Argus looked shaken. Myra's expression was unreadable. Goetia, face against the cracked floor, thought, what just happened? Jean walked forward and said, did he just adjust the gravity in a localized area? He'd never seen a spirit art like that before. Jean looked at the assembled instructors and said, it looked like there was a lot this academy could still learn. Not just the student, but the faculty as well. Goetia was on his feet the moment the pressure lifted, trembling with fury. He demanded to know what Jean had done. Said she'd never heard of a spirit art like that. Accused him of using some cheap trick. Jean told her to calm down. He kept poking at him anyway. The headmaster said she thought that settled it. The heavy-set man stood speechless. Argus said it did. The students watching buzzed among themselves. Did you see that? What was that just now? Mira watched silently and thought that was definitely a special spirit art. She couldn't understand it. Unlike the evolved species who'd grown up under the spirit's blessing, lesser species were supposed to have almost no divine power at all. Just what is that, man? Goetia was still grabbing Jin's collar, trying to compose herself. Nobody helped her with that. Another week passed. Enrollment day. The headmaster stood before the new intake and addressed them directly. The academy taught academics, yes, but at its core, it existed to forge warriors capable of fighting corruptors. Those who couldn't keep up would be expelled without mercy. But those who made it to graduation had a real path to the Holy Knights. Everything depended on their own ability. Up on the balcony, Mira stood with two classmates watching the ceremony below. One of the boys, Elias, noted that it looked like plenty of commoners had made it in this year. The second girl agreed. Mira stayed quiet. Elias nudged her. She told him she could say the same about him. Asked what he was doing at the entrance ceremony if he wasn't interested in other people. He said if there were any high-ranking nobles among the new student, it paid to stay on their good side. Then he looked down and stopped mid-sentence. He'd spotted Jean sitting with the teachers. He asked why there was a lesser species in the faculty section. Mira said, because he was a teacher. Elias stared. Mira asked what he thought of the man. Elias said, what did he think? A lesser species, that was all. Mira replied, thought so, and left it at that. The conversation moved on. Jean, meanwhile, looked around the hall and thought, big academy. Investigating it properly would take time, and the staircase situation alone was brutal. He noticed the students in the gallery looking down at him. If he left things like this, instructors side-eyeing him, students dismissing him, he'd stand out for all the wrong reasons and end up being the most suspicious person in the building instead of doing any actual investigating. He needed to be accepted first. Classes resumed. The headmaster reminded everyone not to slack. First years would leave the complacent in the dust. Then Goetia walked in her own class and looked around. The room was half empty. She pointed at the sparse attendance and asked if anyone even wanted to be there. Mira thought, figures. Goetia thought, full waste of time listening to a lesser species. I made sure to spread the word ahead of time. He'd told students that today's lecture would be handled by a lesser species before they'd even shown up. He introduced Jean with all the enthusiasm of someone introducing a mild inconvenience. Jean stepped forward and said simply, he was Jean. He'd be teaching spirit arts for a while. Looking forward to it. Elias immediately asked if Jean was actually sure about that. Jean said that was for them to decide. If they thought the class wasn't worth their time, they were free not to attend. But there was one thing. He let power run through his hand. He wanted them to promise something. Spirit arts could interfere with a corruptor's regeneration, But that same regeneration block didn't apply to human bodies. On a human, it only left injuries. This power had been created to kill corruptors. So they were not to use it on each other, please. A student immediately shot back that power was power. Said he'd come to see what kind of lecture a lesser species could give and was instead being told not to use spirit arts. Called Jean a weak lesser species, trying to avoid being compared to his betters. The class laughed. Elias and Mira did not. Jean looked at the student and said if he thought Jean was weak, he was free to try him. Strongest attack he had. Fire away. If he could manage to injure Jean, Jean would promise never to show up again after today. The student lit up immediately, loaded an attack, and shouted at Jean not to regret this. Too late to back out now. Someone else shouted at him to stop. They get caught in it too. The student wasn't listening. He fired a thunder arrow straight at Jean. The blast hit. Dust filled the space. The student smiled. A dagger came out of the dust. It passed close enough to trim a few hairs from the student's head before embedding itself in the wall behind him. Jean said if he'd actually meant it, the student would be finished right now. Judging people by appearances alone would get them killed. Elias stared. Was that a spirit art? Jean looked at the class and said, they called lesser species weak, right? But he was stronger than any of them. So what exactly were they supposed to call him? He gave them the answer himself. Teacher. Jean turned to the class and asked, did they know the conditions for activating spirit arts? He pointed at the student who just attacked him and told him to answer. The student stood and said it was imagination. You raised your divine power, pictured what you wanted to the spirits, and they shaped it. Basics. He demonstrated the general motion. Jean said imagination was important, sure, but it wasn't what made spirit arts activate. Spirit power only manifested once you accepted the art and let the wavelength flow through you. He demonstrated it directly. The student asked what a wavelength was. Jean said there were 8 basic ones. Fire, lightning, healing, ice being the 4 they should already know, and showed every single one of them in sequence. Then he continued. On top of those 4, there was gravity control, light level control, air pressure control, and the special shielding he demonstrated earlier. He showed each of those, too. Gishia's reaction was something to behold. Eyes nearly out of their sockets, jaw completely unhinged, thinking you can use all 8 types of spirit arts. Jean told the class it was like shaping light into a sphere and throwing it. He demonstrated it practically, and that was where imagination came in. The wavelength activated the art. Imagination shaped it. He said, now then, let's get started. After class, Jean walked out thinking through his next steps. The academy was huge and students were everywhere. Nothing immediately suspicious on the surface. He needed to find the places students never went. He'd start there. Then he spotted Mira waiting near a pillar. Their eyes met as he passed. She said, just what was he? He said he thought she decided he was just a lesser species. She said she'd admit it. He wasn't normal. There was no way a lesser species could use all 8 spirit arts. Jean said exactly what he'd said in class. Anyone could use them if they learned to switch wavelengths. She told him not to make it sound so easy. She looked around, noted he was drawing too much attention already, and said they should move somewhere else. She started walking. In the corridor, she asked again, was he going to answer her question? Jean said he was just an old man who'd slept in Kodamla village for 100 million years. She said he was quite the comedian, then asked what he'd been doing 100 million years ago. He said a lot of things, but he'd been someone who worked himself to the bone for his country. He'd fought more enemies.